We are facing a tsunami, and everybody recognizes that now. It came into Canada with a force and a speed, though, that surprised everybody. And it means then that the responses that we have to make are going to have to address that urgency. About 98% of the businesses in Canada are small and medium-sized enterprises. Most small businesses in typical times have cash reserves that would allow them to function without income coming in for maybe 3 or 4 weeks. At the time that we're taping this, we're into the 3rd week of lockdown for many of them.
Good morning, Gerard and Perrin. Hello to everyone out there in the Ivey community and beyond. I'm Mark Healy. I'm the Executive Director of the Ivey Academy, the Learning and Development Wing of Ivey Business School in London. One of the 3 guiding principles, the first one actually that we're using right now, is be as helpful as possible. So the school, our clients, the broader market, and to do it in a humble way. As a business school, we know we're not on the front lines of this like our healthcare workers are. This session is one in a series of perspectives we're trying to get and to share in what, I know we're already using this term too much, but it is accurate in unprecedented times. Gerard Seijts, for those that know him, really needs no introduction, but I'll do a short one anyway. Gerard is the Executive Director of the E&O Yanitowicz Institute for Leadership and holds the Yanitowicz Chair in Leadership at Ivey. He's one of our leadership gurus and one of the more colorful characters we have around the school. Gerard, thanks very much for doing this. Gerard and I are very fortunate to be joined by the Honorable Perrin Beatty today. Perrin is a great Canadian, having served in both the public and private sectors in highly prominent and very public-facing roles. Perrin Beatty, PCOC, is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the 200,000-member Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Canada's largest and most representative national business association. Before joining the Chamber, Perrin held the same role at Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. He is a UWO grad. Perrin was first elected to the House of Commons as a progressive conservative in 1972. During his 21 years in Parliament, he served as minister in 7 different national portfolios, including Treasury Board, National Revenue, National Health, and others. From 1995 to 1999, he served as president and CEO of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. He's received honorary degrees and doctors of laws from 3 schools. He's an officer of the Order of Canada. And if we keep going on his resume, we will literally have no time left to interview him. So, Gerard, over to you, please.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Good morning. Good morning, Perrin. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us. I know that you're exceptionally busy these days working on behalf of Canadians. But let me first ask you, how are you doing and how's your family doing?
We're doing well. Like all Canadians, feeling a bit of cabin fever these days. We're looking out the window and seeing that spring is starting to arrive, and there's the temptation to want to get outside. But we're doing really very well. Busy. We've moved all of our operations for the last 3 weeks into virtual offices. So we're communicating across the country with all of our staff. And it's been a fascinating exercise. Lots of lessons learned.
Lots of lessons. Well, let's talk a little bit about those lessons learned, Perrin. Perrin, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce is an unapologetic advocate for business, because business plays a vital role in building and sustaining our great nation. And so, which stakeholders in particular are you talking to these days, and what are your main messages?
Well, our 2 key stakeholders are obviously business across the country, and the other is governments, because this has to be a Team Canada partnership with everybody working together to both protect people's physical health, but also to protect the economic health of the country as well. The Canadian Chamber, Chart, as you know, has 450 chambers of commerce and boards of trade across Canada, and represents some 200,000 businesses. In addition to that, we're partnering, and we've created the Canadian Business Resilience Network. And what it does is to bring together chambers of commerce and other organizations from across the country. So further, over 100 associations are partners with us in terms of saying, what are the needs of business? What are we hearing on the ground? How can we be helpful throughout the crisis and assist governments and help our customers, help the public as well? And then on the other side, we're working very closely, particularly with the federal government, but also with some provincial governments as well, to ensure that, first of all, that they have information about what the conditions are where the rubber meets the road across the country, and that as much as possible that we're able to give them a common position on behalf of government, on behalf of business, so they don't have to mediate among 3,000 different interests, but rather are hearing about these are the broad issues that are affecting business today and where government can help most. And we're also acting as a conduit from government back to business. Each week, for example, we hold video conferences of the associations who belong to the network and of chambers of commerce across the country. And this gives the government an opportunity to use the Canadian Chamber to reach out to that many businesses across the country to get information out to them as well. So acting as a conduit, developing solutions that governments can work with, and also ensuring that we have the best possible intelligence across the country about what's happening on the ground.
Talking about what's happening on the ground, I guess you hear many messages. There's many themes. If you were have to pick three of those main themes, what would those be, Perrin?
First one is urgency. We are facing a tsunami, and everybody recognizes that now. It came into Canada with a force and a speed, though, that surprised everybody. And it means then that the responses that we have to make are going to have to address that urgency. About 98% of the businesses in Canada are small and medium-sized enterprises. Most small businesses in typical times have cash reserves that would allow them to function without income coming in for maybe 3 or 4 weeks. At the time that we're taping this, we're into the third week of lockdown for many of them. And that means that cash reserves are running low, and they're being forced to make critical decisions about laying off staff, about whether or not they're going to be able to stay open at all, and about what condition they'll be in when they reopen. The government programs, particularly the wage subsidy program that will pay up to 75% of their employees' wages, are an absolutely critical lifeline. Main streets in Canada today have gone dark. This program and others, if they're well delivered, can ensure that the lights will go back on at some point. But what's critical at this point is to make sure that we just don't have the announcement of a program, but the cash actually flows and gets into the hands of the people who actually have to pay bills, and also to allow them to keep their employees on the payroll. Now, businesses go to an enormous amount of effort to build teams that have an expertise and that understand the business and that serve their customers well. The last thing they want to do is to lose those employees. And as a consequence, then, having access to these programs and ensuring the cash is actually there to be able to make that payment is critical. So urgency is key here. Flexibility is key. That obviously many of the programs that we're looking at have to be designed literally over the space of days or almost hours. It means that these are pretty blunt instruments, and they often don't reflect the realities on the ground. For example, the nature of supply chains in Canada. Many of the supply chains we have with the rest of the world have been severed as a result of COVID-19. It means that maintaining and building supply chains across Canada are absolutely essential. And we need to make sure that we understand how those function and that we're able to give the support that's necessary. To just give you an example, the trucking sector is absolutely critical to us. It moves the medicine that we need, it moves the food that we need, propane, other supplies that are critical for Canada. Under ordinary circumstances, we wouldn't think of a company making brake pads as being an essential service. When we're talking about keeping the flow of goods in Canada moving, suddenly it does become an essential service. So we have to think through these supply chains, and it means then that governments at all levels have to, when they announce programs, have the flexibility that they're able to tailor the programs to the specific needs of the services that we want to have provided. And that's absolutely critical. The other thing that certainly I've learned from this is the need for coherence and for a coordinated national response. One of the challenges we're facing today is that provincial governments are operating under provincial emergencies legislation. And often municipalities have their own separate programs and policies and regulations as well. That makes it difficult for businesses to do their planning because supply chains run across provinces. Businesses have customers across provinces, and when you have different standards from one province to another about can a restaurant stay open, what is an essential service, and a whole range of other areas, it makes it very difficult to plan. So we need much better coordination in order to make sure that we can supply the critical services that Canadians are looking for at this time.
Perrin, anybody that knows me knows that I've got a bias for speed, maybe to a fault. How do you feel about our response here so far?
Mark, the great worry that I have at this point is we all saw in January or early February the Chinese building all new hospitals in 10 days.
Yeah.
And they were doing it because their healthcare system was going to be swamped.
Yeah.
We knew that was going to happen. We should have, before now, we should have been taking over hotels, retrofitting them to be able to be used for facilities where anybody who was in hospital today that wasn't in critical condition could be moved into there, get them out of the hospitals before, because these are people with suppressed immune systems, get them out of there before the COVID-19 people were coming in, and free up the space in hospitals. We were behind the curve. The government announced that it was going to require quarantine of anybody flying into Canada. That was a week ago. By the previous week, 1 million Canadians had been repatriated. It was a week late. We heard the Prime Minister, I think it was on Saturday or Sunday, saying we're going to require carriers, airlines and trains to look at anybody getting onto their vehicle to determine whether or not they're showing signs of it and not allow them on. The question was, well, what about buses? Well, the answer was, this is provincial jurisdiction.
Right. And what about the ones who don't show symptoms?
Yeah, and so the challenge has been that government institutions lack the suppleness and the speed to be able to respond. So if we're looking at, if we see a recurrence of this in the fall, which I would think is likely, my guess is it is seasonal. We'll see a dip and then see it coming back to some level after that. The good news is we're buying time to get other systems in place. Yeah. We may not be able to get ventilators built in time to help people over the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks, which is going to be as we build to a peak. But we may have the ventilators we need for after that.
For the fall, yeah.
Yeah, and we need to start now doing it. But if it's a matter of how do we avoid the peak from happening, I think the pace is just so rapid that you can't have that sort of a massive restructuring that quickly. Sorry, that's a long answer to a short question.
No, I think to your point, and we see this all over the place. We've got to build capability to move faster. That's what we got to build through this, so that if it happens again or in the next wave, we can actually be more flexible.
Yeah. So another area where government has to look is at government processes and regulations. They have stripped back a lot of the procurement regulations, and they're going to have to be also sending checks to people and then dealing with that in audits after the fact to make sure that businesses have done or organizations have done what they committed to do. And you do that in times of crisis. So it's necessary. But instead of going back to the status quo ante, where it's simply how do we write more regulations and build in more cumbersome processes, we should be asking ourselves, coming out of this, are there lessons we've learned in terms of suppleness and responsiveness and having minimal regulation that achieves the basic need you're trying to achieve without simply being burdensome and costly? So there are all sorts of lessons that already are starting. Another one obviously is the issue of supply chains. A London company, 3M, is in the cross sights of Donald Trump as of last night, because Fox News did a piece yesterday saying that 3M was supplying face masks, N95 respirators to people around the world instead of reserving all of their production for the United States. And the president of the United States attacked them and said he would be using, I believe, the Patriot Act against them. And So what we're seeing around the world is countries saying we're going to hoard any medical equipment and supplies. Too bad, Canada, you're on your own. This means then that both Canadian businesses and Canadian governments are going to have to look at. We've built our supply chains globally on the assumption this is the most efficient way of, at least costly way of serving our needs. But what happens when you get pandemic protectionism?
Right, which is already coming on the heels of 2 years or 3 years of nationalism and movements all over the world, right? Which preceded.
So I used to be defense minister. One of the things you do is you build your defense industrial base. You say, if we were attacked, how do we ensure that we are able to produce the materials that we need to defend ourselves? And in our case, we've built a North American defense industrial base, saying that we and the Americans would backstop each other. What we've learned from this, from President Trump, is don't count on there being a pandemic North American industrial base. Canada's going to have to look at what we do. So it's not dissimilar from after 9/11, where when the border got shut down, manufacturers had to move from just in time to just in case. They had to start building inventories in case there were jam-ups at the border. And you also saw pressure on suppliers to locate production facilities beside their customers so that the supply chain couldn't be cut. There are all sorts of public policy and business questions that we're going to have to ask ourselves. And I think the whole nature of globalization is going to be re-examined as a consequence. We're going to build costlier nearshore systems and ensure redundancies as opposed to counting on the global supply chain to function smoothly.
Perrin, a follow-up question, because you talked a little bit about the importance of urgency. So here's my question. Ever since SARS, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce has encouraged businesses to be ready for the next major crisis. And so, in your opinion, has this message been heeded? And a follow-up question, what are the lessons you see coming out of COVID-19 as it pertains to crisis readiness?
I was very much involved, Gerard, with the SARS outbreak because I was president of Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters at the time. And there were a lot of lessons that we learned. The first is that it's important to have business continuity plans in place so that if some sort of disaster strikes, you have plans that you thought about in moments of calm that you can put in place, that you can answer some of the basic questions that you have to. And the vast majority of larger institutions, that is governments, hospitals, school boards, banks, airlines, transportation companies, and others, had built those plans. They did so as a result of SARS. They did so as a result of climate emergencies they've seen, as a result of the threat from cyber terrorism and so on. And they've tried to game plan various potential scenarios and say, how can we ensure that our business is able to continue and to do so with as little disruption as possible? The challenge that we have is that 98% of the businesses in Canada are small and medium-sized businesses. A restaurant. These are not organizations that have massive planning capabilities. They're kept very busy on a day-to-day basis, just keeping the lights on and keeping the doors open. And so for a very large segment of Canada's business population, they didn't have those sorts of plans in place. And that's why very early in the crisis, when we were seeing the growth of COVID-19 and in China and in Asia initially, then spreading to Iran and other countries, the Canadian Chamber sounded the alarm and said it's very important that all businesses ask themselves some basic questions. If the public transportation system isn't working, can your employees get into the job? What about your suppliers? Do they have business continuity plans? Are you confident that you can get the inputs that you need? Have you spoken to your bank to ensure you have a line of credit that will see you through if there's a crisis? What about if 20% of your workforce were to get ill? Could you still manage? Have you trained people to be able to back up others in your workforce with the skills that are necessary? Pretty basic questions, but what we wanted to do was at least to give people a checklist and give them basic information where they could go down and say, yeah, I've covered off these areas and I'm as well prepared as I could be. So many businesses took advantage of that. We put the information up on our website. We pushed it out through our network of chambers across the country. And many businesses took a look at it and did their preparations, but still I believe for the significant majority of small businesses in Canada, this was a tsunami that hit without them being able to be adequately prepared.
So talking about the tsunami and the very dire situation that many businesses, leaders and employees are facing today, how can leaders in the public, the private and the not-for-profit sectors inspire trust among citizens and employees that we come out of the other side of the tunnel with a sense of optimism and ready to tackle the challenges that are ahead of us?
Gerard, the thing we should all remember about crises is that it's a time of crisis that you see the real test of character. That could be the character of an individual, or it could be the character of a business or of any institution. It's not something you can be fully prepared for. It's not something where you have all the contingencies mapped out in advance and you respond on instinct and you show who you are. The most important thing for businesses is to understand that anything they do needs to be very transparent. The public is watching. We've seen instances where in some cases people have tried to profiteer. They bought up emergency supplies and they've tried to make a profit out of selling them. It's contemptible behavior. And this will come at a very high price for any business that tries to do something like that. On the other hand, we've seen all sorts of examples of businesses and of individuals who've shown just extraordinary generosity and who've said, my interest, business managers who say, my first obligation is to my employees. I want to protect their health and ensure that they're well and ensure that their families have an income. I want to look after my customers and make sure that they're well treated. I want to make sure that the general public benefits as well. I'll give you an example. I was speaking just yesterday to the president of Pizza, a firm that's well known right across Canada. They've contributed 20,000 slices of pizza to people working on the front lines across the country. It wasn't a promotional activity that their ad people had planned well in advance. It was an instinct that this is something that we can do as a business to make a contribution. And there's so many examples of that across the country. So to me, what I've said to my board is we're not going to be calculating or strategic about how do you advance the interests of the Canadian Chamber. We're going to be looking at the assumption we'll operate on is that we will do well coming out of this if we deserve to do well. People will see whether we've served our members, whether we've served the business community and served the country well. If we've done so, they'll support us and they'll trust us and they'll say we want to see this organization succeed. If they feel that we haven't, that we've been simply self-interested and not reached out to contribute as we can, then we won't do well. And the same applies for every organization. So it's a test of character. And those organizations and those individuals who respond well in a spirit of generosity and a spirit of fellowship with other Canadians will do well as a consequence.
So let me push a little bit on that statement, Perrin, because the Canadian Chamber of Commerce has applauded many of the government's measures to provide support to Canadian businesses. In turn, you challenge business leaders to now find ways to keep their employees connected to those businesses. And so, first question, can you elaborate on why that is so important? But more importantly, what positive examples, what positive concrete examples have you seen of leaders that continue to connect really well with their workforce?
In terms of its importance, as you know, Gerard, one of the real challenges that any business has, its most important resource is its human resource. It's the people, it's employees. And what we've been hearing over the last several years, when I've gone out to speak to businesses across the country and said to them, what is the single greatest challenge you have? What's the most important element in your business? It's people at the end of the day. And they often said it's to attract and to hold people with the skills that we need to make our business successful. So building that human resource is a critical part of a business's success in good times. You don't want to lose that resource, first of all. You want to maintain that, and if you're going to maintain it, you have to be genuine in your concern about your workforce and to be as helpful as possible. And the vast majority of employers would fall into that category. Secondly, from the perspective of the employees themselves, one of the things that we need to be very concerned about is mental health. We're always concerned about mental health in the workplace and how we can support our employees on that. People and families are under a degree of strain that is simply unprecedented at this point. Knowing that you have a job, knowing that you have the social infrastructure around you that comes from being part of an enterprise is something that helps to lift some of that burden. In addition to that, of course, there are employee benefit plans. This is first and foremost a health crisis. So many Canadians and their families are dependent upon their employee benefits plan that have drug plans, for example. And never has that been more important to have than it is today. If you're employed, those programs are likely to continue as well. If they're not, you may very well lose them. That is absolutely critical for employees as well. And then knowing that sooner or later the health crisis will end. We're going to be coming out into a very changed world, but knowing that there's a business to go back to, that you still have an employer, that there's going to be a job there, is something that can make weathering the storm that we're in today so much easier. So I've seen in the businesses I've talked to across the country, so many businesses have done everything that they can. They're literally in a struggle for survival at this point. And they're asking themselves, what can I do to ensure that when this is over, we can turn the lights back on? And in instance after instance, I've seen business owners and others who have said, what I want to do is keep my employees on the payroll. If we do get to take advantage of the wage subsidy programs, I'm going to do everything I can to top this up. I'm going to cut my own pay or take other measures which will be a sacrifice on my part because I want to support my employees. And there are thousands of examples of that right across the country. There's nothing. I've talked to so many employers who've been forced to lay off their workforce, people who are family to them, and there's nothing more painful for them, and they're going to extraordinary lengths to try to avoid that if they can.
Yeah. Perrin, in a few minutes that we have left, I think I have two more questions. Question number one, to work on a more positive note, perhaps in these very challenging times, what are you most optimistic about looking ahead?
The resilience of Canadians and the ingenuity of Canadians, the generosity of Canadians. I think back, Gerard, I wasn't alive at the time, but I think back to the time of the Blitz, for example, in London. And what I find amazing is the resilience that Londoners showed under circumstances where every day things got worse, and they did survive, and they did prevail, and it was a test of character, in which character triumphed. What I've seen through the crisis so far is incredible resilience on the part of Canadians, a real sense of generosity, and a desire to reach out and to do something for other people. That, to me, as a commentary on human nature and on the Canadian character, is the single most encouraging thing I've seen. And that has all sorts of implications for Canadian business, because it's the spirit that will allow us to weather whatever storm we have to go through, and to rebuild and to come out of it at the end of the day stronger than we went into it.
Okay. And maybe, Perrin, this is very much related to my final question. What is the one leadership lesson, a major leadership lesson that you have identified going through the pandemic so far, or a lesson that I think maybe you already knew, but it was reinforced in terms of its importance?
I think the single most important lesson is to think ahead of where you are. The temptation when you see the water coming in over the gunnels is to focus on that immediately. And of course, you have to address that. And what we're seeing in many instances now is simply an overload with the number of issues coming in, whether on businesses or on government. And they're having to do triage, deciding what are the critical issues that we have to deal with now, which ones can we put aside for the time being that ordinarily would be major issues for us to deal with, and how can we anticipate issues that are going to happen. Certainly, if we look at the arrival of the pandemic in Canada, we had warning of it. And what we needed to do was to be in front of this, to be able to say, we can't assume that we're immune in Canada. Are we taking all the steps that are necessary to prepare in Canada for the arrival of the pandemic on our shores? Do we have the medical supplies? Have we got the programs in place that will allow us to adjust? And unfortunately, throughout much of this, we've been behind the curve. We've been trying to catch up. An important lesson for us to take out of this is the need to get in front of it. And that means that even as we are catching up today, and we're seeing that as businesses retool, for example, to make masks and other personal protective equipment, or to make ventilators, and as they look at other ways in which they can contribute to the social mobilization that we're seeing taking place, we are catching up. But we need to go beyond that and think about what are the next issues. Is this coming back in the fall? How should we be preparing for that now? And we need to recognize the fact that sooner or later, we emerge from the tunnel. And it's up to us now to start planning for that world that we're going to reemerge to ensure that it's a world in which Canadians can be successful. That certainly includes Canadian businesses. What can we do now to ensure that the competitiveness of Canadian businesses is in place, that some of the lessons that we've learned as a result of this, for example, Gerard, the discussion we're having today, all of our businesses are going to be more digital than they were before. The Canadian Chamber is not going to do business when this finishes, whether it's in 1 month's time or in 6 months' time or in a year's time. We're not going to do business in the same way as we did previously. We're going to be using digital technologies much more than ever before. This is an opportunity for us as businesses think about, how do I reconceive the organization? How can I serve my clients or my customers better? How do I meet the needs of my employees better? How can I be more entrepreneurial or more creative? This is an opportunity for us to create business models that can help to ensure our success once we emerge into the sunshine once again. And it's not too early for us to be thinking about how to do that.
I know that we're at the end of our time. I want to thank you for your time and for your insights. Stay safe. Continue the great work that you do for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and all Canadians. I'd like to turn it over to Mark to bring it to a close. Mark?
Yeah, Perrin, just wanted to say thank you so much for making the time. I'm sure that when this is shared, there'll be a flood of questions. We may come to you through email to see if you'd answer a few of those. Thank you so much for the important role that you're playing as a conduit between business and government, and thanks for making the time for us and for our community.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure, and let me just express a word of thanks to those who are going to be watching this webcast. The acts of generosity that so many Canadians have shown, the vision they've demonstrated, the resilience and the courage are inspirational, and all of us should draw strength from that.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.